This is Korea, the first great confrontation of the Cold War.
The history of Korea is riddled in warfare. Created in the 1st century before the Common Era, the Three Kingdoms of Korea was viewed as a highly cultural state. Starting in the 13th century, neighboring Mongol forces started invading. Afterwards, left weakened, Korea developed an isolated approach to foreign affairs. This lasted until the late 19th century. Being heavily influenced by their Japanese neighbors, they later became annexed by Japan and remained part of the Japanese Empire up until World War II.
Here in the new palace, amid the regal splendor of a departed era, the former King of Korea lives on the bounty of his Japanese masters.
After defeating Imperial Russia in the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, Japan made Korea a part of their empire by putting the Ulsa Treaty into effect. During World War II, Japan used Korea for its resources and labor force. By the middle of the war, Koreans made up 32% of Japan's labor force. At this time, Korea was fully assimilated into the Japanese Empire.
Over the saw-toothed and snow-capped peaks of the Hamadan and Iraqi mountains to Tehran, the route flown by the British and United States leaders and their staffs to meet the Soviet delegates in the drafting of the Plan for Victory. The start of the 4-day conference in the Persian capital, which, in effect, signs the death warrant of Nazi Germany.
At the Tehran Conference in November 1943 and the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the USSR promised to join its American allies in the war against Japan after the USSR's victory in Europe.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The USSR fulfilled said promise when it declared war on Japan on the 9th of August, 1945. The next day, Russian troops were successfully occupying northern Korea. By the time the war was over, Korea was no longer regarded as a part of Japan's empire. North Korea was influenced by China and the USSR, and it maintained Eastern ideologies like communism, while South Korea was influenced by the US and its ideologies. The contrast in ideologies between the two regions led to increased tension, which would later lead to war. Both the US and the Soviets claimed to be the legitimate government of all of Korea.
It is my duty to place before you certain facts about the present position in Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking people.
Before America's Congress, President Truman makes the most momentous speech since the death of Franklin Roosevelt. He declares political war on Soviet Russia. In American eyes, Britain is no longer the bulwark against communist expansion.
The Truman Doctrine was drawn and implemented by Harry S. Truman. This doctrine was the American foreign policy during the time of the Cold War. This policy was put in place in order to contain communist ideas. The U.S. would do so by providing aid to nations under threat of civil war and under influence of the Soviets. This policy led to confrontations between the Soviet Union and the U.S. in other countries or regions.
These confrontations were known as proxy wars.
This tension reached its climax when on June 25, 1950, North Korean troops, backed by China and the USSR, first crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, starting the war. The main attack was aimed at two cities, Ujeongbu and Seoul. Later that day, the UN Security Council declared that North Korea's attack was a breach of the peace. The UN called for North Korea to withdraw their troops from South Korea. However, they refused.
To consider the seating of a regime that has officially condemned the efforts of the United Nations to halt aggression in Korea. These and other statements amount to giving assistance and encouragement to the regime against which the United Nations is taking preventive action. That the sole item of business on our agenda for this meeting should be the question of aggression upon the Republic of Korea.
Later that week, the United States offered that they, along with the UN, would provide aid to South Korea to repel the imminent attacks. 20 other countries of the United Nations would eventually contribute to the defense of South Korea. Subsequently, the UN designated President of the US, Harry S. Truman, as its executive agent for the Korean War. Truman then named General Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander. In the beginnings of the war, North Korean troops faced little resistance. They made rapid advancements into South Korea and drove the South Korean army into the southeastern tip of Korea, known as the Pusan Perimeter. In September of 1950, a UN counteroffensive was launched at Incheon, 100 miles behind enemy lines. This surprise attack cut off many North Korean troops and forced the North Koreans positioned near the Pusan Perimeter to retreat further north. The South Korean troops, with the help of the US, followed the North Korean troops northward. This is when, on October 19th, the South Korean army captured the North's capital, Pyongyang. After this big loss, the Premier of the People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai, informed the UN that if the US troops crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea, that China would have to join the war too. MacArthur crossed the line anyways, believing that the Chinese were bluffing. Even today, this is seen as a very controversial decision. China was fighting on the side of North Korea because they were against the UN. On the 25th of October, 200,000 Chinese troops were ordered to enter North Korea. 12 days later, Stalin ordered the Soviet Air Force to provide air cover for these Chinese troops. As the war progressed, more and more troops were dying, and the UN believed a ceasefire was necessary. Ceasefire negotiations failed, and in January of 1951, the UN passed the Resolution 498, which called for China to remove its troops from Korea. However, they refused. After April of 1951 until the end of the war, little territory was exchanged. This period from 1951 until 1953 is still known today as a complete stalemate. The main battles that were fought during this stalemate were the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Battle of Whitehorse, the Battle of the Hook, and the Battle of Kamsong. Talks of peace continued, however nothing came of them. In 1952, the US elected a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. After being elected, he went to Korea to see what could be done to end the war. This is when many collaborated on establishing the Korean War Armistice, which ended the war, dividing North and South Korea at the 38th parallel.
July 27th, 1953. 60 years ago today. In the village of Panmunjom, in a barren room, the generals picked up their pens and signed their names to the agreement spread before them. That night, as the armistice took hold, the guns of war thundered no more. Along the jagged front, men emerged from their muddy trenches. A Marine raised his bugle and played taps, and a soldier spoke for millions when he said, "Thank God it is over."
After the war, death and destruction was seen throughout North and South Korea. The estimated number of Koreans that were killed or wounded during this war is 2.5 million. This number includes both South and North Koreans. The Korean casualties represent 10% of their population. After the mass bombings of the US and all the fighting, 80% of public industries, areas, industrial areas, and means of transportation were destroyed. The situation was worse in North Korea, and many citizens moved into caves and shelters, hoping to be protected from the elements as well as the Americans. After the war, the North Korean economy grew very slowly. Almost all their factories had been destroyed, and their country was not developed yet to become an economic superpower. Over time, the Soviets withdrew their support from North Korea, leaving the economy even more unstable. In the late 1990s, catastrophic weather plagued North Korea, making everything more difficult and almost resulted in a collapse of their economy. Another effect of the Soviets pulling out of North Korea is that they no longer had a supplier for fertilizer, making growing food very difficult. The North Koreans' new government policy was now self-reliance and national independence. All mentions of communism in their law and government platforms was removed, although this new system was still similar to the old one. In the 1950s, the South Korean economy was slow, but once the country became a democracy, their economy began to grow rapidly. They joined a group called the East Asian Tigers, which included Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, by showing they could produce product at a remarkable rate. The GDP of South Korea grew rapidly until it landed them at 11th place in the world. The policy of the South Korean government was authoritarian, but that all changed in 1988. Roh Tae-woo was elected, and he had new ideas. Roh got rid of all the things that fell under the authoritarian view and made them to be democratic. He allowed for freedom of press and for overseas travel to be allowed, which previously it was not. With these new changes, the growth rate of the economy decreased because of higher wages and strong worker unions. The Seoul Olympics was a great accomplishment for South Korea. This event put them on the international scale for power and led to diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, China, and several East European countries. After the war ended and the USA had proven their military power,
our allies and adversaries must know the United States of America will maintain the strongest military the world has ever known, bar none, always. That is what we do.
the U.S. economy changed. The U.S. moved away from an economic superpower into being a military superpower. The government now spent a lot of money on support and innovating their armies and soldiers. The defense industry in the U.S. took off and boosted their economy greatly. Since the U.S. was now seen as an even greater power, new countries looked to form alliances and relationships with them. The countries that the U.S. allied themselves after the Korean War were Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. They all signed a peace agreement, and the U.S. placed troops in these countries in high-tension areas.
Today, North Korea is ruled by Kim Jong-un. He is the grandson of Kim Il-sung, the first ruler of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Kim Jong-un came to power in 2011 after his father, Kim Jong-il, passed away. Kim Jong-un is the youngest head of state in the world at age 33. Even though North Korea is said to be a democracy, there are very strict rules on its citizens. The government not only watches over its people closely, but it censors the media and restricts freedom of speech. For example, the government makes it illegal for someone to have a certain hairstyle. The North Korean government also follows a 3-generation rule. If someone commits a crime against North Korea, 3 generations of that family must be punished.
북한에는 연좌제라는 게 있습니다. 뭐 범죄를 저질렀거나 아니면 북한 정권에 대해서 범죄를 저지른 사람들에 대해서 그 당사자는 물론 그리고 가족에 대해서 추방 아니면 또 정치범 수용소로 보내지는 사례들이 있습니다. 북한 정권이 그런 것을 행하는 건 많은 주민들에게 공포를 주기 위한 하나의 목적이 있고 또 그 국가에 대해서 반감정을 품은 사람들은 씨를 말리라는 그리고 3대를 멸하라는 김일성의 그런 말이 하나의 법으로 자리 잡고 있습니다. 그런 말 때문에 범죄를 저지르는 사람뿐 아니라 가족까지도 피해를 보고 또 그 가족은 평생
North Korea says the United States is on the verge of committing an act of war and that its reckless, provocative insanity will be met with merciless retaliation from Pyongyang. The U.S.'s transgression is a Seth Rogen comedy due to hit theaters this fall.
In recent years, a movie was dropped featuring James Franco and Seth Rogen. This movie depicts 2 journalists who ventured to North Korea to interview Kim Jong-un. This movie was subject to much controversy, even sparking the attention of President Obama. This film attempts to show the atrocities committed by the North Korean government in a comedic light.
Fake carrots! Fake fruit! Fake! Fake! Fake grapefruits! Fake! Liar! You liar!
Sony later decides to not release the project due to ongoing pressure from the North Korean government.
Lindsay Duncombe joins us now with the latest from Washington. Lindsay?
Wendy, naming North Korea turns the Sony mess into a geopolitical cyber conflict. And because the film that started it all isn't playing in theaters, many worry it looks like America caved.
So I think they made a mistake. I wish they'd spoken to me first. I would have told them, do not get into a pattern in which you're intimidated by these kinds of criminal attacks.
Today, South Korea's president is Park Geun-hye. She's the 11th president of South Korea. She's also the first woman to be in this position. With the recent missile tests taking place in North Korea, the tension between North and South Korea has increased drastically. However, amid said tension, it has continued to maintain its democratic government. Today, South Korea has the lowest unemployment rate, according to the OECD. Their GDP per capita has even been predicted to be greater than that of Japan and the European Union by 2018.
The global fight against communism that would last for 40 years began here, in the wilds of this small Asian peninsula. But unlike the Cold War it provoked, the Korean War goes on to this day. Soldiers from both sides still patrol the armistice lines in Central Korea. Things there haven't changed all that much since that spring of 1950. Today, Korea is the only place in the world where a war is officially being fought. But despite Korea's lingering ambiguities, the men and women who served there were among the bravest and most selfless warriors in military history. Their legacy is one of courage in the face of despair, conviction in a time of indifference, and persistence in the face of overwhelming adversity. Unto these brave soldiers, we owe our deepest gratitude.